Alright everyone, welcome to another tutorial, though this one is going to be a bit different than ones I've done before. This one is going to be more like a workshop of sorts. It's not going to be as concise, but on the plus side, you're going to be able to see how I make something from scratch. And what we're making today is going to be a short gag strip for a series I've called Doom and Gloom Room. It's going to look a little like this. It's just going to be very simple. It's going to be just a few panels, and it's going to use a flat illustration style. Now, something you may be wondering is, okay, what are the advantages of working in a style like this compared to the other style that you might have seen in my videos of Weird Dogs? One of the advantages is that if you're doing a flat style like this, you can allow yourself to be much less detailed in your art. You can be much more simple, and it's still just gonna look natural. As you can see, legs here are literally like stick figure legs. But for that style, it feels natural, it looks good. If I were to outline everything here, and outline the legs, it might look too complicated. But since I'm going for a simple style, with a lot of simple shapes, it also helps that I don't use lines or use lines sparingly, only here to separate the colors and show the difference of hand versus the body. So that's one of the advantages. Ideally, that means that you won't have to spend as much time to try and perfect everything and try to make everything look detailed and correct in your drawing. Because when everything is vague and simple, you leave a bit to the viewer to visualize themselves. They will see what you've put out on the page, and their mind will complete everything that's left. Through context and through basic shapes, you are able to insinuate what you're seeing. For example, if you just look at the hair on this character, without the context of seeing it on a character's head, you probably wouldn't be able to tell what it is because it is maybe too simple in how it's rendered. Something else that I'm going into is the colors. I work with a very simple color palette here, and as you can see on the left, I've made my own color set. If you're not familiar with this, you can go to Window, and you can select Color Set here. You can make a variety of color sets. You can make those by clicking here, which opens up the Edit Color Sets menu, and you can add new ones, move them up and down, rename them, delete them, duplicate them, etc. You can select a new color and rename it. I could make a new color here just by clicking this, and I could double click, rename it, new color, and also delete it. Something you may be wondering is, how do I make a simple color palette? As you can see here, it really is just 3 color groups. So I have the background, and I have 3 values. I have a dark background color, I have a light background color, and I have a medium background color, which in most cases is enough to establish depth. Let's just make this a visual description. If you think of the brightness of an object as being, okay, this is in the foreground, and then the further away you get, let's say it's a misty day, the further away you get, the lighter things are gonna look. The same applies if I'm building a character and I think about shading. There is the basic color of that character. Let's think about just an orb, and then there's the darker color, and then there's the brighter color, so the shadow and the light are there. And since we want to keep things simple, we don't want to add in extra colors, we just want to keep it simple. Sometimes you do need a bit of variety, and so I have one extra variety color, but it's still in that basic palette of reds. And you might notice that the light one is like a bit further away from the red, which is intentional because I want it to be able to set itself apart more. Obviously, the variety one is a bit closer to the reds, but the goal was to have it set itself apart a bit more. One more thing that I can address is my goal with this palette is to have two contrasting characters. As you can see, I always change up the design of these characters, but they're always a bit at odds. Whereas Doom is the red one, is always a bit more angular. Gloom is always a bit more round. And so there's a difference in the shape language. And then obviously to combine that with the color, there is a difference and a contrast in the color itself. So it made sense to me to just have like very simple, a very basic contrast of red and blue, and have that create or underline the contrast that exists between the characters' personality and their designs. And again, yeah, the background was just a goal to have a color that is neither red or blue and cannot be construed as either of them. If I had said, okay, I want the background to be teal, it would be a bit too close to the blue, for example. It couldn't work as well. Now, something like yellow could have worked, but since I want more of a darker tone for the comic, I just went with dark gray that you saw. It creates a unique style, and obviously if you're figuring out your own color set, that's going to take some time to adjust, but once you've done it, just add the colors in your color set, and you're going to be ready to have them there. You can just immediately pick a color and immediately work with it, and you know that those are going to be your exact colors. A question that I've sometimes seen is, how do I get the color set displayed the way that it is? Because by default, you might have a different option. And it's just go to this menu, select View, and then personally I use Medium List, because that way I also have the name that I give to each color in the set visible. Of course, you could also just make a choice for a different type of depiction. There, you don't have to scroll, you can see everything quickly. But personally, I like the list because it gives me an idea of what that color is meant to be. Okay, so let's get right into it. We're going to start with making a new file, and we're just going to start out making it a normal widescreen resolution, 1920 by 1080. That way it's going to display well on a computer screen, not a phone screen necessarily, but we can still move things around and adapt it for a Webtoon if we want to later on. I will probably go into that, but for now let's start with that. Now, one thing you want to keep in mind is that when you create a comic, you don't want the canvas size to be too small, because if later on you want to print it, you want it at a good size. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into Edit, and we're going to go to Change Image Resolution, and we're going to change the scale here to 3. So we have 3 times scale, and it's going to be a lot better in giving us a nice resolution if we ever want to print this. So as you've noticed, the background in these panels is always the same. We can immediately select the background dark color, select our paper layer, and up here in the layer properties, we can select set layer colors. So we already have that background there. Now, to create a panel, we can go in here, we can select the Create Frame tool, and here we have a bunch of options. We have the rectangle frame, we can see that we can draw a border, and we can decide how that border looks. We can decide the brush size of that border, and we can decide even the brush shape of that border. I will be using a specific brush called the SAF pencil, and the reason I want to be using that one is, let me just zoom in here, is that there's a little bit of a texture to the character outlines. In my opinion, that helps if you have such a simple art style, because it creates a sense of texture despite it being simple, which makes it feel intentionally imperfect. Comparatively, I've here used a different brush. This is an older strip. If you zoom in, and for example, you'll notice here a few little edits where it was unintentionally messing up. You don't notice it when you zoom out all the way, but still the principle is true that if you're creating a shape and every part of the shape is irregular, is textured, it's gonna look intentional. Whereas if you have a clean brush shape, you're much more likely to notice the irregularity. So let me just illustrate that real quick. Using this brush, the SAF pencil, I'll show where I got it from in a moment. I really like it and recommend it. And now here, if I use a clean line, the shape, it's meant to be a circle, but this one looks much more irregular than this one, in my eyes anyway. Maybe you see it differently. But here on the left, there is just an intentional roughness to the edge, and everything feels more handmade, and so you're much more willing to overlook an impreciseness, which is also an advantage if you're drawing like a hand on fingers and you're just making it tiny little stubs instead of detailed drawings. So that's one of the advantages of a flat design style, and if you are working in it, having a bit of a textured edge is really helpful, in my opinion. Now, let me show you. These are the brushes, this pack here on the Clip Studio Paint Asset website. Just look for Savlikat's paintbrushes, and I use the Saf pencil. This is the one that I use the most. It's really nice, and I definitely recommend working with it. Alright, let's get back to the comic. And now that I kind of have the basics out there of, you know, why am I using a flat design style? Why am I using a limited color palette? And how am I using that? Which brush am I using? How do I set up the canvas? I want to be going into how do I make the comic? Now this is going to probably be a bit awkward because I am going to be just figuring this out on the fly. I don't have an idea yet. The goal is to start from scratch. For this tutorial, I want it to be even simpler than normal. So I have 4 panels the last time, and maybe this time I only want 3 panels. I can start out just by sketching it and just having a rough sketch of where I want the panels. We can just start with thinking about what we want as the topic for the comic. Just try to think of a single topic that you have in your mind, and once you have that, you can just build off of that. So Doom and Gloom Room in particular is often inspired by personal life things, and I try to make it more general. So today a coworker quit, so maybe we'll make that the focus. And thinking about the recent news of companies firing people and people quitting, we'll center in around that. And we'll focus on the idea of thinking about it as a sinking ship. There's always the 2 characters. Gloom is the one that's going through it, and Doom is the character that's often more of an antagonistic character. Maybe Gloom is on a parachute. You know what? Let's actually do something else. So we'll have just a basic sketch of the character Gloom, and he's just sitting on a chair. And you know what? I'm actually gonna make that Doom. So he's just sitting on a chair. He's gonna be like chilling, and the chair is carried by a bunch of little birds, and they're gonna be like Gloom birds. And Doom is just gonna be chilling. He's gonna be like, yeah, this is good. This is good. We'll think up a dialogue in a bit. For now, we'll just try to think of composition. We can have the speech bubble here. I think in the first panel, we're actually going to try to show that the character is high above the ground, so we'll have some clouds and, you know, show on the ground below little details. So we're setting up in the first panel the status quo. So Doom, in this case, is being carried by a bunch of little Gloom characters. And in the second panel, he's like, you're fired. And in this final panel, we'll just have the speech bubble here. We'll think of something for that in a moment. Maybe in the second panel, we want to have the speech bubble a bit more in the middle, so it doesn't quite squeeze into the corner. We'll add the dialogue later. We'll figure it out. Clearly, this just turned into a Twitter comic, but that's okay. We'll just work with it. So now that I have the sketch here, I'm just going to name the layer sketch. And we're going to be making the panel, as I've mentioned before. We're going to click here and select the frame border tool, create a rectangle frame, and with the brush shape, I will select the Saf pencil. You notice that everything here gets blue, and that's because the feature show mask area is activated. We don't want that, so we're just going to disable it here. Next up, we want to disable the sketch for a moment. and we just want to investigate how does that frame look. Actually, I want the brush size to be bigger. I just wanted the texture to come through more clearly. Now we're gonna fill that layer. We'll just make a new layer. I'm always using the rectangle tool to fill something. There we go. We have the first panel. Something I want to do is I want to change the border color to use the dark background, because that way, if I'm drawing in here, it actually looks intentional. The border is just outside the background color. Now we're gonna just copy that same panel. We're gonna move it over, and we're gonna make sure to name it. So panel 1, panel 2, and we're gonna have panel 3 here. I realize on all the other strips, I have a header title. So what I should do here is I want to move it a bit closer down, and I do that by selecting all the layers by holding down Shift, and now I will press Ctrl T, or I will go to Edit Transform and select Scale or Rotate. I can deselect here Keep Aspect Ratio, and I can just pull this down a little bit, and that way I create room up there for the title of the comic. The same I do with the sketch to adjust that. Let's move on to actually creating the content of that panel. As you remember, I mentioned that I wanted to have a bit of a background there, just to kind of know how the character is high above the ground. You always want to use a reference. So I can just look up a picture of a landscape seen from the sky. To put up a reference, I often use the subview panel. You find it again in Window, and down here, Subview. Let's just open up that reference. There we go. I just want to start making a few mountains here in the distance, creating a bit of variety. The light stuff could be seas and lakes that are reflecting off the ground. Something I'm not enjoying is the fact that the dark just juts out of the panel. As you can see, sometimes I do use a few other colors. So in this case, I can go here and say I want more of the medium color. There we go. We selected a new color, and we're filling it with the fill bucket tool. Let's add a few clouds. We need something a bit brighter if we're adding clouds. It's honestly not very detailed, but we're taking this information here, we're taking all these details, and we're creating a very simplified version of it. Through the context, we'll be able to convey the information, we'll be able to communicate with the reader that what we're seeing here is, in fact, a landscape seen from above. If we see the birds carrying the other guy flying, and we have the clouds here, that already helps. Like, I think without the clouds, this is too vague. But if we have the clouds, we know, okay, that's the sky, so what we see below must be the ground. And if we then add in the character with the flying birds, we'll be able to fully convey that idea. Now we want to design the character, and we want to make the chair the character is sitting on. We want to start by making that the darkest color. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna make it a light color, like one of those garden chairs. One more reason I came to that idea is that in the sketch I drew the character wearing sunglasses, and usually I use the light color to draw a character's eyes or the speech bubble. But in this case, if we're having no eyes, then we also don't really need to use that color that way. So we'll be able to use the dark color for the sunglasses. Okay, so this little guy is just sitting here having a grand old time. As you can tell, the shape language is not always possible to be fully clear. You're not always going to be able to have an exactly clear silhouette. And in my opinion, it's perfectly fine to sometimes have the hints of outlines, as I've shown earlier, in creating a face, or sometimes helping to create a sense of a hand or a finger. So it's perfectly fine. So even if it's a flat style, you can still use line art as long as you use it sparingly, only when you need it. So maybe right here, I don't actually need it for the leg. I think it's good to have it for both. You know, sometimes you just need to trial and error until you get it right. Something that I think is also important is just to keep in mind that you don't want to like add shading for a flat style unless you really need it for the context. And as you can see here, there is a bit of a highlight here, a bit of a shadow here, but in general, the simpler the better. So ideally, you don't need shading unless it's necessary for the narrative of your comic. Okay, add some highlights to the sunglasses and add horns to the character. One of the core design elements, as Doom always has some little horns here and there. Okay, so he's just floating there. And we'll just make sure that we name all the layers. Just to keep organized. It's very helpful, so it's worth the effort. Now let's move on to Gloom. We'll be creating the lines that they're hanging off. Gloom lines. And we'll just make Gloom 1. I feel like I'm gonna have to switch to the darker color to be able to work with the constraints of the color palette and keeping everything recognizable. So only the head and the front wing will be in the brighter color, and part of the body and the back wing will be in the darker color. I'm gonna add the line that's tied to the character, and I'm gonna create a little face for the character. Something I want to show you here. I can name this Gloom Body, and because I know I'm going to be working with multiple little bird characters here, I can create an asset of this, and I can make it easier for me to just have these different characters. So in here, I'm opening up the material window. As you can see, I open that up, and I can here now under image material I have already a folder comic characters. There's one for Dodger, and I can create a new material folder, and I'll just call that one Gloom. Now I can just pull in this Gloom Body, and I'm able to just pull that over. Of course, I could also copy and paste it. Now the difference is if I want to reuse this character again in a different strip, I can just pull from that material folder in a different file and have it immediately ready. I don't need to open this one again and copy, go to the other file, paste it. I can just open this and pull from it, and I'll have these assets that I reuse commonly. Something that was kind of stupid is I should have just put the clouds on their own layer, because now I'm finding I want to move them around. But I can just like select these clouds, cut them, make a new layer, paste them, and just name that layer clouds. And in here, the background, I can just fill those holes of the clouds. There we go. Now I can move them around easily so they're not obstructing the characters. This time I will just copy the layer, and I'll want a bit of a variety in here. So I will be drawing them again manually, but still, if you want to reuse things, then it can be quite a good option. Okay, so I have one Gloom ready. We'll just get another one right away. We'll just call that Gloom 1, Gloom 2. Maybe I will end up simplifying it a bit and have less characters in there. And what I'm doing is I'm just drawing at this point, so I know there's not going to be as much talking. What I'm realizing now is that I want the ties to actually show up on the chair to make it seem like the chair is tied to the strings. So I want to adjust that, and I'm putting the chair in the background and I'm making the lines actually be tied to it. So I'm gonna be redrawing them. There we go. To show it's tied to it. I can also go to the chair and add a bit of depth. What I did here is I locked the transparency. So now anything I draw or paint will not go above what's already on the layer. And that way I can create a simple shadow for the character, which I think in this case is helpful to create a bit of a sense of depth. Now, something that bothers me here is the shape language is a bit messy. There's too much happening all at once. So I'm moving up that horn so that there's not a little gap of sorts. I'm just closing that gap. Obviously, I need to move up the rest as well. But I'm closing those gaps I created and just moving everything up. It's important that things don't get too detailed, especially in a flat style. You want to do everything you can to just make everything communicate the idea as clearly as possible to your readers. If there is a way to simplify things, take that option. Because that's the goal in a style like this, is to just simplify things and communicate clearly. Alright. I think that looks much better. Let's create a third gloom. Once again using a bit of a line art here, but it's still simple enough. Okay, and we'll be making the last one. Okay. So we got that first panel here. Maybe move that bird a little bit and adjust that line a little bit. Want to move the cloud a bit to convey the sense of characters being high up a bit better, just to make the clouds more clearly visible. There we go. Just readjust things on the fly. Okay. I think that's a good first panel. Oh yeah, I should probably save the comic. The head felt a bit empty, so he's just gonna get some Charlie Brown here. I think what I can do here is I can just straight up copy the content of the first panel and put it in the second panel. I'm gonna be able to reuse quite a lot here. We'll just copy it, move it over. What I want to start with here in this case now is I want the speech bubble there. So I'll make a new one. And as I've mentioned for the speech bubbles, I use the brightest color from a character's palette just to make the dialogue more clearly that of the character. I'll call that one speech bubble, and I'll call that one dialogue. I'm realizing I want a different composition. I want 2 speech bubbles there. So I'm just moving the text around. Obviously, I could also be using a font, but for this comic, I always try to make everything by hand, including the text. I'm having an idea, actually. I want there to be 4 panels after all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and use the cut frame border tool. And I'm going to pull that in here. And you can select how wide the line is supposed to be. I'm just using it to slice the panel in half. The panel still is here, just the background that was there is now gone. But now I've copied the background back in, and now you can see everything's still here. I'll make a speech bubble. I'm hoping this comic is going to be prophetic. This is going to be what's going to happen. I doubt it. Not optimistic enough to believe this. It's just wishful thinking at this point. But hopefully, even if you're not involved in the whole Twitter thing, you're going to be entertained by this comic and think it's funny. I think I'm going to have the character look up. We'll create a panel here where the character is looking above, and just so we get more of a close-up on the bird's expression here. We still in the background want some detail to insinuate the ground below. We're just adding a little bit more variety there. Just to have something below the character. In the next panel, we'll show the character cutting off the bird's strings. Or let's just keep it at untying. That way he doesn't have to pull out scissors from anywhere. Here we're making everything even more simplified than before. Now what's really important to me here is establishing the clouds again to convey that sense of the character floating. They're only being supported by one bird anymore, so everything should be at a tilt. Okay, I think that already helps. And now for the final panel, we just want everything to be a blur. Just falling, falling, falling. And we just have barely in view. Doom still sitting. And this time I think I will actually copy him from the first panel. Something I want to do is also create speed lines for the character. Just to fully sell the idea that the character is also just the one falling. Okay, now I only need to come up with a dialogue that's actually funny. It's gonna be easy, that's the easiest part of a comic. A final good punchline. Awesome. So now we've got the comic all finished. And maybe what we want to decide to do is we want to not just share the comic on, let's say, Twitter, but we also want to share it as a webtoon. So what we're going to do that is we're actually just going to copy that and we're going to rename that to be the webtoon version. And what we're going to do now is we're just going to delete the sketch. We don't need that anymore. We're going to collapse all those panels. And it's going to be pretty easy because we're just going to rearrange things very quickly. Now, we're going to change the canvas size. We're just going to make it wide or tall instead of wide. There we go. So that's the first panel. And what you'll see here is that I have everything kind of dim if something isn't in view. And what that is I have the on-screen area setting enabled, which gives me the idea of where the default phone screen might land. What is that phone screen displaying when the viewer opens the webtoon? So I want to go and adjust out here and just pull those panels all below. If you've watched my other tutorial on creating comics for webtoon and print, you know that sometimes you're going to have to space things out for creating a bit of drama. Now you're going to just make that a bit more tall, just to create that sense of, okay, what's going to happen next? And there's a webtoon ready version. As you can see, when the viewer first opens it, they'll only see the first panel. They'll keep scrolling. And after here, there's going to be a bit of a pause, and only after they scroll down, they see the punchline. So there's a sense of a rhythm to it. We can now export as a webtoon. Here we can specify the width, which I think 800 pixels is good. We can divide it vertically, so we'll immediately get the files split up to how we need them to be. As you can see, here everything is split up into these 6 files, and that's going to be ready for the upload to Webtoon. And there we go. If you have any questions, let me know. I'd love to answer them and help you make more comics like this.